My experience at the National Gallery, and it was one of the reasons I didn't stay there, is that in succession, there would be major pictures which were on loan to the National Gallery, owned by well-known families in Britain. And they would be worth somewhere between, the Madonna, the Pinks was sold to the Getty for 35 million. And then there was a Titian, which was offered to us for 27 million. And then there were a set of Poussins, which were offered to us for 80 million. And it was like, you sat in your office, and no sooner do you acquired one than there'd be a knock on the door. And the next person would say, oh, well, you've acquired the Raphael. Do you want to acquire my Titian? And
right.
It was fine when you could do that. But actually, the cost of these works is becoming unaffordable. And I began to find it a bit oppressive, the fact that my entire life was devoted to very complex and tricky negotiations in which I was trying to essentially sort out the problems that these people were having with their roofs and their families in order to transfer ownership from private ownership to state ownership. And as I say, it's interesting up to a point, but in the end, the reason I moved to the Royal Academy is I preferred the kind of range of working with contemporary artists rather than having these endless tough, very tough, difficult negotiations.
Thank you for being with us. Wanted to talk about the future of museums. Yeah. I figure you know a lot about that. What do you think about the future of museums?
Well, I've been thinking inevitably, I think like everybody, we've all had much more time to think because of lockdown. And
yeah,
I think the truth is it's unclear. I had a long discussion yesterday with somebody who's not a conventional museum goer. And he was making the case that actually the effect of lockdown is that people will get used to doing a lot of things online and streaming and visiting virtually. And he was of the view that actually it's tough to travel and to visit and to go to the Louvre and there are crowds. And if you can get a version of the same experience online, then people may convert to doing it online. I don't believe that. I think the truth is that as soon as museums reopen, the evidence is the more you can see things online and the more digital access to works of art there's been, the more people want to see the real thing, because online is a good version, but it's not the same. And over the last, whatever it is, 50 years since the Second World War, there's been a huge increase in museum visiting, which has gone in parallel with the ability to find out about art through books, through teaching, and online. So that I'm of the view that nothing will change.
I just did the tour of your old stomping grounds, the Royal Academy, looking at the summer exhibition, the 2020 summer exhibition. I have to say it was quite wonderful to feel like I was in a museum for a moment, because I haven't been in a museum in over a year. But I don't know whether you really get the same effect looking at the pictures online as you do standing in front of them. What do you?
Well, I think one has to be a bit cautious, because for a long time, people said people wouldn't buy art online. But actually now people are buying art all the time. I can remember having a conversation with somebody in Sotheby's in New York. And he said that somebody from Brazil, who they had had no previous contact with, bought something costing $80 million. And for them, that was unheard of, just because most people who buy art want to see it before they buy it. They want to check it out. They want to look at the condition. And the idea you might buy something sight unseen, at that stage, this was in about 2010, was unimaginable. But I think that has changed. It's a bit like shopping. People thought you wouldn't buy clothes online, but now everybody does. So that we'll see, but certainly my experience was that in the period where we could visit museums, I mean, we had one lockdown between March and June, and then there was a period in July and August, September, where one could go to museums. And you had to book. So it was a bit different from just turning up and wandering around. But actually, I found that people were going with, in some ways, greater intensity, just because they had been deprived of the experience. And once they were allowed to have the experience, they were going to make very good use of it. So they went with a slightly different order of attention, looking, going around slowly. I mean, you had to go around slowly, partly because at the National Gallery anyway, everybody was in a sort of line and you couldn't skip. And actually, I found that rather powerful.
Did you find that different than it was before?
Yeah, I did. Because, I mean, at the National Gallery, 60% of the people are tourists. And if people are going as tourists, they're going to check it out. It's a one-off visit. You know, they'll have the tour guide and they'll want to see the key pictures. But that's rather different from, I think, the traditional idea of a museum where you go and you go again and you get to know the collection and you experience it over a long period of time rather than just a one-off visit. And my sense, of course, it may just revert. I mean, the experience of the last pandemic in 1918 is that once the pandemic is over, everybody forgets about it and you go back to normal life. But I think it's been such a long period of time that people have been deprived of these experiences that at least for a while, they'll value them differently.
I have a question, Charles. In the way that between the two lockdowns when people were going in line, were they first of all socially distanced, and were you given an amount of time that you could stand in front of a painting? And does that affect the experience? Whereas, you know, in kind of normal times, we're all huddled and we're, you know, did you notice that it might affect the experience of the viewer?
Well, so I'm basing pretty well everything I say on the National Gallery, only because that's the only place we went to in the period where we were able to. And we went 2 or 3 times. We went to the Artemisia Gentileschi exhibition, and then we enjoyed it so much. Oddly enough, I think what's happened is that people now go to exhibitions. They don't go to museums in the way they used to for the permanent collection. But actually, what we found was once we'd seen the exhibition, we started going around the permanent collection. And I mean, of course, I'm not a standard viewer because not least I've worked there and I know the collection very well. But I felt that a lot of people were doing what I was doing, partly because you had to. You were in a sort of line because of COVID, everybody was socially distanced. So you couldn't skip the line, which meant that everybody was going from picture to picture. And that meant that you paid attention to pictures which you wouldn't normally. I include myself. I mean, in general, I'll go into a room and I'll look at the pictures I want to look at, and then I'll go on to the next room. Whereas what we were required to do was look at each picture in turn. And I found that rather powerful. And I had the sense that other people, partly because it's to do with slowing down, that we've got so used to looking at things at speed. And in a way, we've got used to treating museums as tourist experiences, not as experiences where you spend time with single works of art.
You know, Charles, is it hard to photograph snow?
Incredibly hard. Maybe you've been reading my blog. I mean, I don't know what it is. You see, I've been impressed on social media how there are great pictures of like New York streets in the snow. So I thought, okay, I'll go out and take a picture of the street in the snow. And actually, I don't know whether it's, I just use a camera phone. I'm sure if I had a proper camera and you can slow it down so that you can take it on a slow speed, then you can photograph the snow. But what I realized is that in most ways, I think camera phones work incredibly well. They're very powerful, but actually taking snow is not so straightforward.
Now, when you walk through, how long have you been walking through Victoria Park?
Victoria Park's our local park, so I know the area incredibly well. I mean, about 6 years ago, my PA said to me, you should start doing a blog. And the idea of that was, when I was still head of the Royal Academy, was the staff should know what I was doing. But actually, what I found it was very helpful was when I was traveling, and also when I was at home, it made me look at things slightly more intensively. And I would go around, I mean, I would photograph them and I would write them up. And then I did a book about East London, which was based on these entries.
Now, East London, you've been in East London in these homes for a long time. Like how many years?
Yeah, so
they're called Georgian homes. Yeah, those are the homes you like to live in. Yeah.
Well, so we now live in a house dated 1741. I mean, we bought a big old house which had been an exhaust pipe garage, and nobody realized, including us, that behind the shops was a pretty unspoiled 18th century house. It hadn't been lived in since the 1870s, because in 1870 it was converted into a carriage works, and they built the carriages in the back, and they didn't bother to use the rooms, so that the rooms have this rather wonderful atmosphere of rooms which people haven't used for 100 years.
But when you walk East London and you take these photographs, you're acutely aware of what they were in the past. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, East London is this neighborhood which has different layers, because the house.
So what is that? Is that Wapping and Limehouse and Shadwell? Like what's the?
Yeah, exactly that. So you start with the Tower of London, and then you have Wapping, then Shadwell. You're exactly right. Not many people know of Shadwell as an area. And then you go on to Limehouse, where we lived for about 20 years, and then on to Poplar. And then north of that, you start with Whitechapel, we're in Limehouse, we're in Stepney, and then you go on to Mile End. And each of these neighborhoods has a slightly different character.
And if you look now, you see very tall buildings in the distance towering over this area. So what has that done to the area? How's that affected this area? So
London was low rise till when? 1980, roughly. And then then Canary Wharf was built in the late 1980s. And at that stage, the idea was that Canary Wharf would be the Manhattan, and that would allow the city to remain as a low rise, a bit like Paris. But what seems to have happened is the city got jealous of Canary Wharf. They didn't want all the big banks going off to Canary Wharf. And so they liberated their planning. What people haven't realized, I think, is that actually now the old city, which was quite well preserved till about 1980, has now, bit by bit disappeared, just because it's become like every other international city, full of huge, great skyscrapers.
So is that, and there's one city planner who that was his plan, yeah, and he's gone now, but how big an effect has he had on the city?
Well, so there's this guy, now I've temporarily forgotten his name. I mean, I did know his name. I kind of knew there was one person who was the head of planning. And actually, of course, in the end, it's the planning authority which allows these buildings to be built. And in fact, I looked him up, and he was very proud of the fact that he had converted the city, as he described it, into a major international financial center. And I can see the argument that actually the traditional city, which was of relatively small scale, old-fashioned institutions, has been revolutionized. And that probably is good, although who knows what will happen post-COVID when people don't want to go back into big tower blocks. I mean, that's the thing I find. You look at the city, and even now, there are these huge, great, gigantic towers going up, probably the same as in New York. And then at the same time, everybody's working from home. So God knows what will happen post-COVID.
So, the National Portrait Gallery, it's Mary Queen of Scots, William Shakespeare, Byron's there, James Joyce. Thinking about the city, the way the city has changed, the National Portrait Gallery, it's such an important institution. There's modern names in it as well. But what is the responsibility to protect this history? How do we not become the city planner who mucks that all up?
Okay, well, that's a good question. So when I became director of the National Portrait Gallery in 1994. And from my perspective, it was somewhat old-fashioned, very traditional portraits on the upper floors. And they had just, when I went, opened the ground floor for contemporary portraits. And when I was there, we started doing much more contemporary culture. We did much more photography. We did big, Richard Avedon, Annie Leibovitz, Tony Snowden. And I still bear the scars of having done an exhibition by Mario Testino. That was before me too. But what's interesting is then the next director, Sandy Nunn, who took over from me in 2002, he changed it, not a huge amount. I mean, he did more probably in terms of sport and popular culture than I did. But now there's a new director who's been there about 5 years, and it's currently closed. It's closed for 2 years, 3 years, and he's rethinking it. And I mean, of course, I'll be interested in what it looks like. He's raised a lot of money, 35 million, to represent it. And they're changing the building a bit, but also what they're doing is redisplaying the collection. And I suspect what they'll do is a version of what museums are doing, goes back to what I was saying about permanent collections, is adjusting the balance from the permanent collection arranged systematically to doing things more thematically. I mean, I've read some of the press he's done, and I can understand he's against the very celebratory, traditional British view of heroes. I mean, it's inescapable that the Portrait Gallery was founded on the ideas and beliefs of Thomas Carlyle, who believed in heroes and hero worship. And the idea was that you understood history through single individuals. Well, now that will change.
Doesn't there have to be a play? Like, yeah, we do need Bruce Weber and we do need Annie Leibovitz, but don't we also need William Shakespeare and Lord Byron?
I'm of the view, I mean, when I was there, we kept and redisplayed a very systematic historical collection on 2 floors where you could learn about British history by walking through it. And yeah, you started with the Tudors and you started with Henry VII. You looked at Henry VII, and then you moved through to Queen Victoria and the Victorians. And my view is that still remains a legitimate way for understanding British history. But of course, it's very unfashionable because the fact is the collection is predominantly male. It has very little social diversity, and it tends to be dominated by politicians and writers. And there has been a shift over the last 20 years, and I mean, I participated in it, to thinking about portraiture as an art form, not just as a kind of form of photography, but the way artists represent people. And I suspect that shift will go one stage further.
So I'm curious about what you're saying here, because, what is the balance between the gallery as portraiture of art and history? And now we have, so much influence around identity politics and what is history, and at least in the United States, we are really challenging all of that. And so what do you think the influence will be now when the curator is really determining, what we should be looking at? You have such an important role. And, you are helping us decide and you are making choices, or someone in your position makes choices about what we're learning. And how are we going to adjust to that, do you think, in this time?
Well, I think the way we're all trying to adjust is to be more liberal in the way we represent the past, and to include a broader range of people for good reason. So that aspect of it, trying to display the richness of historical experience, not through a very small number of people. Not surprisingly, I'm supportive of that. But on the other hand, I still think that history, you can't escape the fact that history happened in the way it happened. So that, we're going through exactly the same culture wars as you're going through. And actually, in the last month, I've been working on an issue which I found very interesting, where you may know this architect incredibly well. He was fantastically well known, Philip Johnson, who was the big person who brought modernism to America through an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1932. And then everybody half knew that in the late 30s, he became incredibly right-wing and rather pro-Nazi. That wasn't a secret. In fact, he was prepared to talk about it. He did a long interview with somebody, architect called Stern, which was published in 2008, called the Johnson Tapes. And people were a bit ambiguous about him during his lifetime, because there was a feeling that he had been involved with disreputable politics in the 1930s, held views which people knew were extremely disreputable. But on the other hand, he wasn't prosecuted, so that he was on the FBI's list in the early part of the Second World War. And he wasn't allowed to go into, not surprisingly, intelligence, because he had a black mark on his writing paper. And somebody said, look, this person is not suitable. But on the other hand, he became a huge, great, internationally important architect of great importance and celebrity. But now, 2020, Harvard, no less, which owns what was his thesis house, done in 1942. He went back to college in the Second World War, and he designed a house which was given to the School of Design, and it was sort of known as the Johnson Thesis House. Now, Harvard now has decided that it shouldn't be known as the Johnson Thesis House. It should just be known as 9 Ash Street. And it's to do with this thing of, I can understand it. His views were incredibly reprehensible. And nobody is pretending that his views were in any way supportable, including him. So that, to what extent can you, so to speak, abolish him from the history of post-war architecture? I don't think you can, because whatever you do and whatever you say, he remains somebody who was important. He built the Chippendale building, the AT&T building in New York with the sort of little Chippendale top. And that was very important. And this sense that somehow you can change history, you can change people's perception of history. I'm totally in favor of people investigating what he did think and who he was and the complexity of his personality. I don't have any anxiety about that, but you can't abolish the fact that he was important. And I think that issue of how do you depict history, I mean, it definitely is an issue and will be an issue for the portrait gallery. its collection, I don't know what the percentage is, it's probably 95% male. So if you want to show women's experience in the past, which you do, and I would, but it's tricky to do because you've got this vast collection and it's 95% male. Of course, you can privilege the 5%, which is what we've been doing, what we did when I was there. But at some point, you can't change history. And I think that's the issue we're all trying to grapple with at the moment in a way which is obviously very tricky.
In answer to that, do you just collect the pieces, keep them in your collection, and then as times change, emphasize different aspects of it?
Yeah, so I was very aware. When I was there, we just redisplayed the late 20th century collection. And the very nice, highly intelligent curator wanted to show the experience of women as far as we could. And so that she picked out the well-known women. And when she was doing, you can do it with photography better than you can do it with the main collection. You can adjust the perception by showing more women and privileging women's experience. But at some point, you can go so far, but in a way you can't go all the way. You still have to, I think, try and show, my view would be to show that history was very unbalanced. I mean,
right.
There weren't equal rights.
Yeah.
Right. Do you remember when you saw Raphael's Madonna of the Pinks, and why was that an important, picture to acquire?
Yeah, I most certainly do, because it was a big experience for me. So that I went to the National Gallery in 2002. I started in July 2002, and in September, the head of Sotheby's came to see me to say that he had negotiated the sale of the Madonna of the Pinks to the Getty. And it had been on loan to the National Gallery for 10 years or so. I don't know how much you know about the story, but it's a sort of remarkable story that it had been bought by a Duke of Northumberland in the 1850s as a Raphael. It actually says Raphael on the frame.
Right.
But he bought hundreds of pictures. I mean, Alnwick House and Zion House in London, they're still full of old master paintings. And a German scholar came to Alnwick in the 1880s and decided it was not by Raphael. And so it was in the monograph as being not by Raphael. And the thing about attribution is that, especially, Alnwick is not the most convenient place to go to. Once a major scholar decided it wasn't by Raphael, it got pushed out into the corridor and everybody thought it wasn't by Raphael. And then a curator from the National Gallery, Nick Penny, who was my successor as director, went there in the early 1990s, and he thought, that looks interesting. And he brought it back, actually the Duke of Northumberland delivered it to the National Gallery, and they did what's called infrared reflectography, and they found the underdrawing. So it's by Raphael. So that when I arrived, it was a huge issue. I mean, who knows what the view would have been if it had been offered to my predecessor, and he had had time to think about it and knew the cost of it. I don't know, but for me, it was presented as a challenge.
And how did you meet the challenge? Is this one of the difficulties of being the top of the museum? Is how do you figure out how to acquire something that costs that much?
Yeah. I mean, my experience at the National Gallery, and it was one of the reasons I didn't stay there, is that in succession, there would be major pictures which were on loan to the National Gallery, owned by well-known families in Britain. And they would be worth somewhere between, the Madonna of the Pinks was sold to the Getty for 35 million. And then there was a Titian which was offered to us for 27 million. And then there were a set of Poussins, which were offered to us for 80 million. And it was like, you sat in your office, and no sooner do you acquired one than there'd be a knock on the door. And the next person would say, oh, well, you've acquired the Raphael. Do you want to acquire my Titian? And
right.
It was fine when you could do that. But actually, the cost of these works is becoming unaffordable. And I began to find it a bit oppressive, the fact that my entire life was devoted to very complex and tricky negotiations in which I was trying to essentially sort out the problems that these people were having with their roofs and their families in order to transfer ownership from private ownership to state ownership. And as I say, it's interesting up to a point, but in the end, the reason I moved to the Royal Academy is I preferred the kind of range of working with contemporary artists rather than having these endless tough, very tough, difficult negotiations.
Now, is it a lot different working with contemporary artists to try and figure out what you're going to acquire and how it all goes together? Because there's, it looks very different on the wall, the relationships between the paintings. Sometimes I don't really understand how they're put together.
I find the experience very different. So when I was at the Portrait Gallery, on the one hand, I would be doing these sorts of negotiations around acquisitions, but they were not nearly as expensive because historical portraits you could acquire. We acquired very interesting things for not huge sums of money. But simultaneously, I was working with contemporary artists where we were acquiring either things that they did or commissioning. And I mean, artists can be difficult to deal with, but I found the fact of dealing with contemporary artists interesting. I mean, artists have, I think, always, they're interesting people. And because of what they do and what they create and their attitude to the world and their attitude to art is different from an art historian, because it's about the way they view the world and the way they depict it and the way they represent it. And I found that side of the life in art gallery, in the end, more stimulating than the acquisition side. And that's why I moved to the Academy, because even though dealing with 80 artists was not at all straightforward, it was interesting.
What makes something worthy of bringing it in to the gallery? Like when you're going through and you're determining, how do you make decisions?
Okay, so that's a good question. I'm interested. At the Portrait Gallery, I mean, obviously my two big experiences are the Portrait Gallery and the National Gallery. The Portrait Gallery, we would have a group of curators. Each of the curators would take one century, and then I would be like the umpire. And we would sit around every fortnight, and each of the curators would say, oh, I've seen this, I've seen that. And we would do it collegiately, collectively, where each of the curators would argue the case, and then everybody else would often argue against them. But actually, I found a very interesting, robust, and enjoyable system. And then I would have the final word to an extent. But it was done collaboratively. When I went to the National Gallery, the sums of money were hugely different. So if you bought the Raphael Madonna the Pinks, the early Italian curator and the Dutch curator and the Spanish curator wouldn't be able to acquire the pictures they wanted to. So it was much, much more competitive, in which each person was trying to undermine the case of the others. And it was culturally different. But in terms of the decision-making, in both places, you would have to put whatever you wanted to acquire to the Board of Trustees. And at the Portrait Gallery, the trustees would often decide, were expected to decide, not on the quality of it as a work of art, but on the interest and importance of the sitter. So they were like the people who would adjudicate. I mean, of course, Byron is not a good example because Byron is but I can remember Thomas Paine, the Republican. In fact, we didn't acquire Thomas Paine, and that was a form of self-censorship, although they did acquire the bust subsequently, interestingly. But the curator felt, oh God, the trustees aren't going to like this Republican.
Yeah.
And so we didn't put it. But at the National Gallery, it would be on cost and quality.
It's hard to understand England's relationship to Byron because it's still so complex. He's still not, a beloved character there in certain realms. I don't really understand. If he was American, they would treasure him and love him. You know what I mean?
I think people love Byron. I mean,
yeah.
There are endless biographies of Byron. We did a little exhibition about Byron, and I don't remember anyone being uneasy or uncomfortable.
Yeah.
The person we were uncomfortable with, and actually we took down, was Robert Maxwell.
Right. Well, yeah.
So when I arrived, there was a huge, great picture of Robert Maxwell. But
right.
what in a way that's interesting because Robert Maxwell was a significant figure. They've somebody called John Preston's just done a biography of him, and there's a huge amount of interest. So he's been converted from somebody who was regarded, which he obviously was a big villain.
Yeah.
But now somehow the effect of history, I can imagine that in the new display, Maxwell might come out of storage.
Yeah. When you're at, the Museum of New and Old Art in Hobart, right? What goes through your mind is a museum an encyclopedia of treasures, or is a museum something else? And fundamentally, how is that going to affect the future? Because I imagine they have less great art there in Hobart, but they're, are we going to start disappearing the past and just coming up with an experience, and it doesn't matter what the paintings are anymore? Like, how do you think about it?
Okay, so that's a good question. The Museum of Old and New Art. Somebody said to me, I've just done this book called The Art Museum in Modern Times. And I gave it to a friend called Mark Pachter, who was the director of the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. And he said, the book's fine, but you've got to go to the Museum of Old and New Art because it will show you a different way of doing things. So in February, just before lockdown, just before coronavirus, I booked to go to Hobart for the day, which was in retrospect an incredibly stupid thing to have done because actually you need more than a day there. And what I didn't know is that they actually have a hotel. So I didn't need to stay in Sydney. I could have stayed overnight at Hobart and got a good feel for it. It's designed in a way to annoy somebody like me because it's unconventional. It's about an experience. It's not about major works of art. All the works of art are about either sex or death. It's this man called David Walsh who made a huge amount of money out of gambling. And he did a conventional museum of antiquities. And then he thought, this is really boring. I mean, it probably was boring.
Yeah.
Because it's hard to get great antiquities. And he decided to go around the world. He went around the world and he had a couple of people, Australian curators, they all went around the world looking at museums and galleries which they thought were interesting, not in terms of their collection, but in terms of how you experience the collection. And the whole thing about Mona is that it's not about single works of art. It's about you go on a boat and then you walk up the steps and then you get a ticket and then you go down deep into the earth. And then
it's all underground, right?
Yeah, it's all underground. And it's all done so that you explore it. I must say, I thought it was incredibly impressive. I'm really pleased to have gone because in a way it helped me analyze what I think has been a long-term change, which is away from history towards experience. that the museums people like and enjoy are in a way more like Mona, where you explore and you find things out, and where it's about the experience of the visitor and you're not being told what to think.
Yeah.
And I find that interesting.
Now, is that so different from the Louvre that's so big that you lose your mind when you're walking around? You can't possibly see it all while you're walking around. Is it a fundamental change?
Yeah, I think the thing about the Louvre is it's a systematic collection. It shows the cultures of the world displayed historically, sequentially. Of course, it's too big. Nobody in their right mind would try to see all of the Louvre in even a month. You couldn't. But still, I think people know that it's a version of an encyclopedia. I mean, actually, the director of the Los Angeles County Museum, I mean, you will know better than I that they've demolished the old Los Angeles County Museum to do this completely new building. And the director did a lecture in 2014 in which he said the experience of a museum is not like an encyclopedia, it's like a poem. And I think that's a very good analogy for the difference in the experience. You're not trying to learn things, see things systematically and absorb them. You're not being taught. You're going around and you're having a private experience. And I found what he said, I mean, as you will know, LACMA, the redevelopment of LACMA has proved to be hugely controversial because there are lots of people who say, but hang on a minute, I want to see the 17th century pictures and I want to learn about Italy, and they've been collected in that way. And I don't want them all to go into storage. But the fact is, that's what's happening in museums globally.
You know, a couple of years ago, Jesse did a piece for the Getty around, and it was really with a Baldessari. It was a whole story around, you know, people being intimidated about looking at art and going into a museum versus, you know, just being in one's life and experiencing things in one's life with art. What do you think about for people who may feel, I don't know how to look at things. The museum feels, as an experience, feels intimidating. Any words of wisdom for someone to encourage them, perhaps, to take
the thing that I think museums have been grappling with, in a way, Mona is interesting because it's about dethroning the work of art and trying to encourage each visitor to feel that their own experience is legitimate. There isn't a correct way of viewing pictures. You can view them however you like. So that one of the things they've done, which I think is really interesting, there's no labeling, but there's a system whereby you carry around a handheld device and you can listen to several different narratives. So you can listen to Walsh, the owner, talk about how he acquired the picture. And you can listen to the curator, which is called Art Wank. And then I forget what the other voices are, probably the voice of the artist. And I think what's clever about that is to try and make clear to people that there isn't a correct way of viewing works of art, that people get intimidated because they think somehow I don't know how to respond, and that there is a correct way to respond. And so I think what people have been doing is to encourage people to think, well, respond. It doesn't matter how you respond.
Right.
Enjoy it. And don't feel that there's one way to do it. You don't have to be Kenneth Clark. You can be yourself. And your response is different from Kenneth Clark's, but it has its own legitimacy. And that's, it's presumably the same with classical music, that people have found concert halls intimidating for very similar reasons, because they had a ceremony around them, and there were people sitting in the front row who looked as if they knew what they were experiencing, and then newcomers felt intimidated by that, and in a way for good reason, because they were set up to be slightly intimidating, and everybody's trying to get away from that very ceremonial aspect of art galleries.
You know, what are the lessons of the Euston Arch being destroyed? You know, like that tell us about the future of museums.
Okay, so I mean, the Euston Arch, many people, including me, still regret, because it's a bit like very similar to Penn Station in New York, a huge, great classical building, which made the experience of travel into something which felt ceremonial and adventurous and exciting, with the language of classical architecture and the arch and big ceremonial halls. And that was all demolished in the 60s at Euston, in the same way as in Penn Station in New York. And well, Euston Station is a horrible place to go to because it's very crowded, and you know, there's nowhere to sit, and there's that sense of travel being an adventure. And it's the same. I mean, Penn Station is even worse, except now I notice they've just opened a new Penn Station because they realized it was a big mistake, and that actually people want somewhere which has a sense of ceremony. So the lesson of Euston Arch for me would be, you need to be a bit cautious about the abolition of history. And people like that sense of there being a ceremony. And I don't think, I never heard anybody feel that Euston Arch was intimidating. And people like me are rather nostalgic for Euston Station. After all, people forget that people got very, very close to demolishing St. Pancras, which people thought was a Victorian monstrosity. And now St. Pancras is the place, you know, where you take off to Paris, if we were able to at the moment. But and it's all been revitalized, and the hotel has been turned into flats, and it's a wonderful building.
Well, thank you. This has been great. I really appreciate your insights, Charles, very much. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And when you come to Los Angeles, let us know.
Yeah, look
Hopefully,
us up.
Yes, and take us on a tour through all our museums here. That would be incredible.
We can have a drink. We can go to the Getty.
Yeah.
If I come, I've sort of half arranged that I might do a talk at the Getty. So
Nice.
I'll put you on the invitation list. Very, very nice talking.
You too. Thank you, Charles.